Hello, my name is Olu Osha. I've been doing an expose on American presidents, and when we're talking about American presidents, if you get to study them, you're actually studying U.S. history, and so this is fun for me. Now, in the last video I did, I mentioned that none of the antebellum presidents did anything about slavery prior to the outbreak of the Civil War while they were presidents, which leads me to do this clip on what the presidents did after their presidency. So, to be fair, I'm going to go into two of the presidents who were actually pro-slavery, right? So they were of the Democratic Republican Party. The Democratic Republican Party, they were mainly strong in the South, and of course, their progeny was the Jacksonian Democrats, which came subsequently in the era of the presidency of Andrew Jackson. So James Madison and James Monroe, both of them were Democratic Republicans. They were both slave owners from Virginia. What did they do after their presidency? Now, they did form the American Colonial Society, right? The American Colonial Society, and the objective of the American Colonial Society was to actually resettle or remove and resettle freed slaves back in Africa, right? And so James Monroe, like I said, was a member. In fact, Liberia, which was created by the United States government, and maybe not the United States government, but people affiliated with the United States government for the purpose of resettling freed slaves. So Liberia, the capital is named after James Monroe, President James Monroe, Monrovia, right? So basically that's what they did. So understand that during the antebellum years, when slavery was still legal in the South, there were still debates. There were debates at the time regarding what to do, how to abolish slavery. And even people like John Adams, who was against slavery, he never owned slavery. President John Adams, our second president. Well, his belief was that they shouldn't, try to do anything to abolish slavery in the South, because it could, light a fuse and cause a conflagration. It could cause major societal upheaval, disruption, and he didn't want that. So he thought, I guess naively, that slavery would just gradually die off, on its own in the South. That the Southerners would find it so reprehensible, so ignoble, that eventually it would go out of favor in the South. So that was what John Adams did. On the other hand, his son, John Quincy Adams, notably when he became a congressman after he was president. John Adams is the only president that after he was a U.S. president, he actually served in Congress until his death. He was representing Massachusetts. Now, he became a vocal opponent of slavery. He was very vociferous, so much so that the Southern Democrats, who were slave owners and pro-slavery, they actually came up with a rule called the gag rule in Congress. The gag rule basically precluded any discussions on slavery, any petitions whatsoever, to discuss or try and end slavery. So the term they used was tabling. So, the tabling meant, they actually were precluding any discussions, any attempts to mention or discuss slavery in Congress on the floor, right? So the gag rule was there, and it was there to silence the abolitionists, people who had anti-slavery sentiments in Congress. But John Quincy Adams, to his credit, he was an attorney. He was a brilliant man. He used his brilliance on the floor, and he worked very proactively to end the gag rule, and which he did. So the gag rule lasted, and it was ended about 1844, and this was due to the work, the advocacy of John Quincy Adams. Now, something else John Quincy Adams did after his presidency and during his time in Congress, he represented uh, escaped the escaped African slaves. If anybody's seen the movie The Amistad, it starred Jimon Honsu. I don't know how you pronounce his name, but he's an African guy. It was about these slaves who had been captured and they revolted on the ship and they won their freedom, but I guess they were captured, arrested, and they were tried. Now, John Quincy Adams was approached by some abolitionist groups, and they got him to represent these slaves at the U.S. Supreme Court, and he represented them, and he actually won their freedom, and the U.S. Supreme Court ordered their release and return to Africa. These were the great things that John Quincy Adams did on his part. Now, so like I said, what did presidents do while they were U.S. presidents of the antebellum era? What did they do regarding ending slavery? Absolutely nothing, right? Again, most of them believed that slavery you know, would end on its own, in the South, and many of them would argue that it was a states' rights issue. Now, states' rights, you'd see that it comes up a lot. Some people think states' rights was merely proxy for slavery, right? So when the South was advocating states' rights, the Democratic Republican Party, the Democratic Party, they talk of states' rights versus what the federal government could do. Some people say it's proxy for slavery. However, remember a time states' rights was brought up. This was prior to uh, the enactment of the Compromise of 1850, or the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which ended up being the catalyst to the Civil War. States' rights had been brought up by John C. Calhoun and his nullifier party. John C. Calhoun was vice president to Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, of course, was a southerner, a slave owner as well, and he was pro-slavery, but he was against the nullifier party, and he threatened to hang anybody who said that the states have the authority to nullify a federal law that they believed was unconstitutional, right? And that was what uh, the nullifier party was advocating, right? Uh, However, the nullifier party of John Calhoun and his era in the 1830s, they were advocating states' rights not for slavery. It was a tariff issue, right? The issue was tariffs, right? That the federal government was levying high tariffs, which protected northern industries versus what the states wanted in the South. The states of the South, which were slave owning, they wanted low tariffs, right? So that they could import they could import European goods. So that wasn't about slavery. This was about tariffs. So um, I just wanted to clarify that some people who argue that states' rights is merely a proxy for slavery, maybe things linked to slavery, but that's another issue. But I just wanted to clarify that matter. So, what else did American presidents do? Presidents after the Civil War and during the Reconstruction era, people like James Garfield, Chester A. Arthur, and Benjamin Harrison. In fact, Benjamin Harrison advocated for federal funding of education of freed black slaves. These presidents post Civil War who were Republicans, they believed that the only way that uh, these freed black slaves could get equality, in fact, was through having an education that was equal to what white people had. So Benjamin Harrison tried hard to propose legislation in Congress to fund for federal funding of education of freed black people in the South, in the U.S., and also to address something called the Blair. It was called the Blair Law. The Blair Law was a way that it was a novel thing that they had developed in the South to sort of disenfranchise uh, black people from voting using education, right? They were literacy tests. And so this was one of the reasons that Benjamin Harrison was advocating for education, federal funding of education of black people in the South. So he wasn't successful, however. Now, other things that they did was, appointments of black people, giving them federal appointments. There were jobs that these freed black people actually were able to do in the federal government. James Garfield, Chester A. Arthur, James Garfield appointed, notable black people like a guy called Robert Brown Elliott. Brown Elliott, he worked in the Treasury. Remember that there was the patronage system, and the patronage system had jobs. There were federal jobs that actually paid a lot more than cabinet position jobs. For instance, Chester A. Arthur held some of them. As Comptroller of New York, Chester A. Arthur made more than the President of the United States. So that was a patronage job. So these presidents of the Republican Party, after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era, they provided these jobs to the newly freed slaves. Black people now had jobs in government. In fact, there were also, black senators. What's his name? Robert Brown Elliott, who was a black man who was born in England. He was born in Liverpool. He was a brilliant man. He actually went to school at Eton. So he wasn't a slave, but he immigrated to the U.S. after the Civil War. I think he came around 1867, and he became a lawyer. He studied at Eton. Eton is considered the most prestigious secondary school in the English-speaking world. Eton is in England. Prince William, Prince of Wales, he went to Eton. So the kings, they normally go there. Prince Harry, they went to Eton. Their father also went to Eton. So so you can imagine this guy who was a black man. He went to school in Eton. So he came to America after the Civil War, and he settled in South Carolina. He studied law, qualified as a lawyer, and he became Attorney General of South Carolina. And he was elected to Congress. He became a member of Congress representing South Carolina, and he got a patronage job. He worked in the Treasury Department, I think. Other appointments were Frederick Douglass. Most of us know Frederick Douglass, who had been a slave at one time. He became Recorder of Deeds in Washington, D.C. So these were the things that Reconstruction era presidents from the Republican Party did to help, the newly freed black men and women, I suppose. So, however, people would say, man, this probably was tokenism, right? There were black senators, mind you. There were black senators like a guy called Blanche. His name was Blanche Bruce. He was a senator from Mississippi. He was born into slavery. His mentor was Roscoe Conklin. He was a senator from Mississippi. That's Blanche Bruce. And so there were many others. Now, people would argue that this was tokenism. Now, remember the patronage system, right? When the patronage system wasn't about qualifications or merit, right? The beneficiaries of the patronage system, the spoil system, which was started by Andrew Jackson, were white men, right? Now, after the Civil War, again, the saying, to the victor go the spoils, the Republican Party took it to another level, right? And so they abused it. And of course, they were not only rewarding white men, they were also providing jobs that they had been barred from to black men. Now, the patronage system is not about qualifications. It's not about merits. Take, for example, Chester A. Arthur. Chester A. Arthur was once chief engineer of the state of New York's militia, chief engineer. Chester A. Arthur was not. Uh, he was not. He was not an engineer. He was never qualified as an engineer, but he got a patronage job as engineer in chief in the state of New York's militia, right? He was an educated man. He studied classics at Union College, and he read law. A lawyer is not an engineer, right? Engineering is very numerical. It's very numerate. It's very mathematical, right? Lawyers are known not to be mathematical, especially people who study classics, right? Chester A. Arthur was a smart man, but he was not a qualified engineer. So through a patronage job, he was a white man who got a job he was not qualified for, but we don't call it tokenism, right? So something else he did, he was commissioner of taxes. He worked as, he worked, as a commissioner of taxes. He worked as a collector of the New York ports, right? Those are accounting jobs. Again, he was a lawyer, not an accountant, but he was doing a job he was not qualified for. Nobody talks about that. So that was just the trend. That was a convention that, white men during the patronage system, the spoil system, got jobs they were not qualified for. So continuing with the patronage system, when black people were freed, especially since they didn't have any education, right? They were appointed to jobs. And I would argue that many of these people, so many of them were qualified for the positions that they did. Take, for instance, Robert Elliott. Robert Elliott was Attorney General. Right? He graduated from Eton. He was a qualified lawyer, and he worked as an Attorney General. At one time, he was Commanding General of South Carolina's militia. His job was to fight the KKK, but that was when federal troops were there supporting them. Unfortunately, like I said, with the Compromise of 1877 that led to Rutherford Hayes being president, with the acceptance of the Democratic Party in the South, the Reconstruction era ended, and the federal troops that had been protecting black civil rights and helping them, do their jobs, these new jobs, that the patronage system gave them as well. This was withdrawn. The federal troops were withdrawn, and of course, the white Democrats in the South, there was a resurgence of white supremacy and suppression of blacks and civil rights, and of course, there was a rise of the KKK, and of course, white supremacy and Jim Crow laws and the gradual disenfranchisement of black people. So they were no longer Congress people and senators. They couldn't even vote, because they had all these rules and things that they used to impede, their civil rights. So something else I wanted to just quickly mention about Chester A. Arthur, because it seemed like I was critical of Chester A. Arthur. Chester A. Arthur, prior to becoming president, actually did something. He represented a black woman called Elizabeth Jennings Graham in New York. So she had been discriminated on a streetcar in New York. So he was a young civil rights attorney at the age of 24. He helped win her case. And in New York, they said that, that colored people could not be excluded from riding these streetcars if, they were sober, if they didn't have any disease, they were well behaved, they couldn't be excluded, they could ride these streetcars like everybody else. And so he won her some money and damages, and it led to the desegregation of streetcars in New York. That's Chester A. Arthur. He represented a black woman. Her name was Elizabeth Jennings Graham. This was an 1855 decision. This was prior to the Civil War, and this was in New York. So New York also had, even though they didn't have slavery, they were anti-slavery, they were free states, but they had de facto segregation, right? They had de facto segregation. They didn't have de jure segregation, right? But they had de facto segregation in New York as well. So I want to keep this video short and tight, and I was just talking about what some of our presidents in the antebellum era and presidents of the antebellum era and Reconstruction era did for Black Americans to help advance, their civil rights and abolish slavery. The 13th Amendment is the law that abolished slavery. So I'll do more videos. I want to keep this short and tight. My name is Olu Osha, and I've been doing these videos, and I also remind, my audience, if I have any, of the abuses, the 14th Right Amendments that I'm suffering in Montgomery County, Maryland, where there are color of law violations that have violated my rights, my human rights, my dignity. I was removed from my home on May 16, 2023, using a manufactured emergency evaluation petition. It was a swatting, it was a sham thing. Nobody gave me my rights. I wasn't given any notice. I wasn't given any hearing. I wasn't given any impartial judge. I was just removed, and I've been wrongfully detained ever since. It's over 2 years now, and I've been trying to create awareness that these abuses against Black people, people of African descent, they still occur in America. I'm a law-abiding American citizen, and it's unfortunate that I'm being wrongfully detained in the state of Maryland. It's a former slave-owning state, and they still have these archaic laws and archaic practices and discriminatory and racist practices, and they still have many of these judges that are still very frankly racist, but they do it, they try and do it in subterranean fashion. They use subterfuge, they manufacture things, they create false evidence, and it's interesting that this is what I'm experiencing. I'm seeing firsthand that these things still exist. Again, my name is Olu Osha. I've been wrongfully detained in Montgomery County, Maryland, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the court. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.